Hi there, welcome to this quick tutorial on expression language in 28 minutes. We don't really need 28 minutes to discuss about expression language, EL. We'll discuss what is this expression language and why do we need expression language. And then we'll look at what are the different implicit objects which are offered by EL. This tutorial is video number 5 in the series of videos where we are developing your first Java web application. We started with developing your first Java web application. We learned what servlets are, JSPs are, then we learned what JSTL tag libraries are, and now we are going to learn about expression language. In the next video, you would learn how to play with a real world Java application. How do you do exception handling? How do you do form validation? How do you do internationalization? Those are the things you would learn in the next video. In this video, let's focus on expression language. Let's get started. The first question which is typically asked is why expression language? There are things like JSTL. There are scriptlets. Then why is there a need for something called an expression language? In the initial days of Java web application development, people used to write a lot of scriptlets. In scriptlets, I can write Java code. And that means I can do a lot of things in here. I can even call a database and change a value. And that's exactly what we don't really want to do in a JSP. In a JSP, we should focus on just displaying value and not on things like updating something and things like that. If I allow Java code to be written in a JSP, then those are the things which are possible. We would want to avoid that. The second reason is this particular expression looks almost like a Java method call. So I'm doing a request.getAttribute.name. This almost looks like a Java method call. And I would really want my view to be maintainable even by people who don't know Java. Let's say there is an HTML developer and I would want him to be able to maintain the JSPs. This kind of a syntax is easy for them than writing a method call like this. So if I want to get a value from the request, instead of saying request.attribute, get attribute, I would say request scope.name and put a dollar open bracket, close bracket around it. That's it. I mean, this is the way you access values in an expression language. And this makes it very, very easy. So the reasons are two. One is maintainable code. Using scriptlets is considered to be unmaintainable code. And we would want to avoid writing Java code in a JSP. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is we want HTML developers also to be able to contribute to Java projects. Syntax like expression languages are easy to understand rather than calling Java methods. Those are the two primary reasons why expression language was introduced, and expression language is now almost used in every JSP Java based project. Even templating frameworks like FreeMarker, Velocity use some kind of an expression language. The exact syntax might be a little different, but they use the same concept to display. So now that we understood what is EL and why use EL, let's move on to the next topic. Let's discuss about expression language implicit objects. As we discussed in the JSP tutorial, there are implicit objects for JSP as well as EL. If you look at this particular expression language expression, we are using a variable called request scope, but we are not defining the request scope anywhere here. So that's why this request scope is an implicit variable. In every JSP, this is available by default. This is implicitly available in every JSP. That's the reason why we call it a implicit object. And because this is belonging to an EL, this is called a EL implicit object. Let's first use the request scope and print something to the output. We are using an IDE called Eclipse and we use Maven to run our projects. If you really want to set this up and get it going, then I would recommend to go to the first video in this series of videos and get set up. There's also an installation guide available in the description. So you can use the installation guide to set this application up. What we have is a very simple servlet, first servlet, whose URL is /first, which redirects to first.jsp. I mean, that's all that you'd need to be able to run the examples of this particular tutorial. What I would do is I would want to print something in the request scope called name. So let's go and put a variable in the request scope. So what I want to do is in request, I want to set an attribute. Request.set attribute. I would want to call it name such. So the name of the attribute is name and the value is such. And I would now want to display this name in the JSP. An expression language syntax is very simple. It's dollar, open brace. First thing which would come here is usually the implicit object. Here I'm going to get the value from request. So it's request scope and the name of the variable. The name of the variable here is name. So if I go here and change it to, let's say, instead of name, if I call it batsman name, I can use it as batsman name. Let's go ahead and run this application. We use Maven to run this. So I'll launch up terminal, right click properties to get the path to this particular application. It's present here. Select location, do ambient Tomcat 7. We use something called a Tomcat plugin to run the application. This is a very, very beautiful way of running the application, especially because it reloads the application when we change something automatically. I really love that feature in here. Okay, the application is started. As we saw earlier, the URL is /first. So I have launched up the browser, went to the URL localhost:8080/first. I see Sachin printed in here. So we were able to use expression language and get the value from a request. What I want to do now is I would want to pass in a best batsman tag. I want to pass in best batsman is equal to Bradman, and I would want to print that to the JSP. So I want to take this parameter which is passed to the servlet and put it to the JSP. How do I do that? The way I can do that is by using an implicit object called param. Param implicit object refers to a value which is passed as a parameter in the request, and I'm accessing a parameter called best batsman. So the way syntax is very simple. Param is default for a request param, that's the implicit object, and I'm doing best batsman because that's the name using in the URL. The best batsman I want to pass is Bradman. Let's see what happens. Now it prints Bradman. If I'm passing in best batsman is equal to Sachin, it will print Sachin. So whatever parameter is passed in, we took it and we are displaying it in here. Actually, we don't really need any of the tag libraries because we are not using any tag library. So it works. Let's now go to the first servlet and let's create a list and a map. What we want to do is we want to create a list of objects and also another map. What I've done now is in the first servlet, I've created two simple collection objects. The first collection object is a list. It's a list of batsman name. So I have Bradman, Sachin, Lara and Ponting. So I have 4 elements in that particular list. And I'm setting that as a request attribute. So I'm calling it best batsman list and setting it as a request attribute into the request. The next thing I've created is a map. This map I'm calling best batsman centuries map, and the values which I'm putting in here is how many test centuries each of these batsmen has made. So I'm putting map.put Sachin, 51. That's basically saying Sachin has 51 centuries. Bradman has 29. Lara has 34. So I'm creating another map and setting that attribute into the request. Let's now use expression language to get these values in the view and show them. Let's start with the list. So I want to get these values in the JSP. We set an attribute. This is not a parameter. This is an attribute. I'll remove this. I would start with request scope because we set it into request. I'm going to use request scope and just do this. Let's see what the output is. You can see that the entire list is printed. So when I say request scope dot best batsman list, whatever values which we put in here are used and shown here. Let's say I want to access only Bradman's value. How do I do that? Bradman is the first element, so he's at index 0. So the way I would do that is by adding 0. Only Bradman is printed. Let's say I pass in a value to, what's the output? It's Lara, because Lara is second in the list. To make it easier for ourselves, I'm putting the entire list in here. So this is 0, this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. So when I say 2, Lara is printed. That's good. So when I say 3, who's printed? Let's say I say 4. 4 is something which is not in the list at all. What happens? Empty. And that's where the real beauty of expression language is. In an expression language, if you give something which is an error or something which throws an exception, it is gracefully handled and empty is displayed to the output. If I used a scriptlet to display this value, it would have thrown an exception. So that's another reason why EL is preferred, because because EL gracefully handles exceptions. Now let's go to the map. Let's see what happens with the map. So first let's print the entire map, request scope that batsman centuries map. Let's see what's printed. You're seeing that the entire map is printed to the output. So Lara is equal to 34, Ponting is equal to 41, Bradman is equal to 29, Sachin is equal to 51. Let's say I want to get the value of Sachin. In a map, you get the values by using the key. So this is the key. So I use the key to get the value. So if I want to get a particular value of something, the way I do that is request scope dot best batsman century map dot Sachin. Again, it's case sensitive, so you have to use the exact case. So it's Sachin with a capital S, so I'm going to do that. And you'd see that 51 is printed. That's the value for Sachin. If I pass in Lara, 34. Ponting, let's say Dravid, not in the list, so it shows as empty. Again, exceptions gracefully handled. You can also access the values from a map using the typical syntax of accessing a key. So I can do something of this kind as well. Request scope, the name of the map, and the key which I want to get the value of. 29. So that's how you access values in a map and in a list from a request. It would not make a difference if it was put in this session. So if the same value was put into this session and not the request. So if let's say this value was not put into request, but this value was put into session. How do I put values into a session? So I would say request.get session dot set attribute best batsman century map. So now the attribute is put into session and not request. So if I try to access this value right now, it would be empty because there is nothing in the request. To access a value from sessions, I use session scope. Let's refresh and you'd see exactly the same output as before. So here we are accessing value from session. The main difference between putting a value in request and session is that in a request, the value is only available for that particular request. Once you put a value into the session, for the entire duration of users' use of this particular website or web page, even when it goes to the other servlets, this value would be available in this session. You should be very cautious with putting values into the session because they would use memory and they would be present for the entire duration of the user session. If you want a value to display something on a page, always put it into request. Put it into session only when it's needed across a number of different servlets, and if you put something into session, make sure that it's removed at an appropriate time. The other implicit variables which are important in an EL are param values and header values. We earlier looked at param, which is used to get the value of a particular param. We'll now look at param values, which is the entire list of parameters. That's the request parameters. And we will also look at header values, which is the entire list of headers. Let's start with header values. I'm saying $ open brace header values. This is an implicit object, so it's already available. Let's see what happens. When you refresh, you would see that all the header values are printed to the output. So you see that the accept language is a header, cookie is a header, and host is a header, and connection is a header. So all these are printed. If you want to access a particular value, the way it is done is by saying header dot the particular value. So it's printing the value for the header called host. So that's how you access a value from a header. The other thing is param values. The way we access param values is by just saying $param values. And I go here and there is not a single parameter right now. Let's pass a few parameters. So batsman name is equal to Ponting, and I'll pass another parameter, dummy var is equal to dummy. You'd see that all the parameters are now printed, dummy var, batsman name, and everything. And let's say I want to see what is the value which is passed to a dummy var. That we already looked at earlier. We say param dot dummy var, and it shows that the value which we are passing for dummy var is dummy. So that's what is printed in here. We looked at why expression language is important, how it really helps us write very simple code to access values from request, access values from session. We saw how we would use EL to access values in a list, access values in a map, and we saw how to use EL to access values from request and headers. Those are the typical things that you do in an expression language usually. In a JSP, the preferred approach to access values from request or session or anywhere else is by using expression language. So go ahead, use EL extensively, avoid scriptlets as much as possible. Actually, don't write scriptlets, use EL always. This brings us to the end of this particular tutorial on expression language. As you know, this is video 5 in a series of 6 videos. In the next video, we will talk about a real-world Java application and understand how things like session management, exception handling, logging are done.